As far as vampire movies go, The Night Flier is a fairly competent film. It's not the best of its, frankly, oversaturated genre, but in regards to the acting, special effects, and overall execution, it's not half bad. However, it's The Night Flier's themes and critiques of sensationalism and audience capture in the media that set the film apart from its blood-sucking brethren. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. If you're interested in horror, Stephen King film adaptations, and vampires who are apparently so full of their victims' hemoglobin that they literally piss blood, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. This is the second video in the Nightmares and Dreamscapes series in which I will be discussing the 1997 film adaptation of The Night Flier. In the first video for this series, I ranked and discussed all 24 of the short stories from Nightmares and Dreamscapes, including The Night Flier, and in the coming weeks, or months, depending on how long it takes me to make these suckers, I will be doing videos for all of the screen adaptations that the Nightmares and Dreamscapes collection inspired. Okay, since The Night Flier has a vampire in it, I wanted to use this opportunity to break out one of my occasionally recurring costumes and revisit one of my favorite segments on this channel, which I haven't been able to do in quite some time. I am, of course, referring to my Count Dracula costume, complete with the fangs that make it hard to pronounce S words, and the all-time greatest idea I've ever had,
Vlad joke.
Good evening. Why don't vampires use autocorrect? Because they love typos. Get it? Typos and type-O's, because typo is a blood type. And also, as I mentioned in the intro, The Night Flier is a decent movie. It's one of those King films that strays a bit from the original story while still managing to tell the tale in a way that... I gotta do better with these fangs. Anyway, The Night Flier is a decent movie. It's one of those King films that strays a bit from the original story while still managing to tell the tale in a way that is mostly loyal to the source material. And at its heart, The Night Flier, the short story as well as the film, aside from being a vampire story, is a story about how the media captivates and captures their audience's attention, often in morally dubious and sensationalized ways, and is conversely about how a reporter or journalist may become subservient to their audience's biases and inclinations. But before we get into all of that mess, let's talk about the film's production and critical reception for a little while, and we'll begin with a brief summary of the film to get us started. The Night Flier, 1997 film adaptation. A brief summary. Richard Dees is a reporter for the tabloid rag Inside View, and in this business nothing sells papers quite like blood, guts, and gore. So when an actual story about an airport-hopping serial killer and a puddle jumper falls into Dees' lap, he's dead set on not only getting the story but in solving the mystery of the fly-by-night killer. And Dees is willing to go to some extreme lengths to get what he wants. After a number of visits to a few small-town airports, Dees begins to piece together just who or what he is dealing with, and eventually he comes face to face with the Night Flier himself, which leads to his undoing and an abrupt end to his career as a tabloid reporter. History and background. The screenplay for The Night Flier was co-written by Jack O'Donnell and the film's director Mark Pavia. The Night Flier appears to be the last film that Jack O'Donnell worked on, and I wasn't able to find much information about him online outside of the fact that his career as a screenwriter began in 1933 on a feature-length film entitled King for a Night. And his filmography predominantly consists of long-forgotten westerns. Oddly enough, his career seems to have come to a halt in 1944, and then suddenly he was back in action writing for The Night Flier more than 50 years later. That's quite a gap in O'Donnell's resume. As for director and co-writer Mark Pavia, as opposed to O'Donnell, his filmography seems to begin with The Night Flier, and the films, or rather, the film he has released in the years that followed are virtually unknown, such as 2016's Fender Bender, and, well, that's it, really. There is an as-yet unreleased film called Sick Nick showing up on his IMDb page, but aside from that, Fender Bender and The Night Flier are all I can find. So yeah, an elderly man with a long-defunct career writing westerns in the early days of movies having actual audio, whose last film prior to The Night Flier was 5 decades in the past, and a fresh-faced newbie with almost no future in the film industry, neither of which even have a Wikipedia page, were the two tasked with writing and directing the film, which, I mean, honestly, they did a decent job considering on paper this pairing and their hiring on this film makes no sense whatsoever. When writing the screenplay, O'Donnell and Pavia did what they had to do to pad out the runtime and added a character, reporter Catherine Blair, who was not in the original story. Blair was written as an adversary to Richard Dees, and she's portrayed as the competitive rookie reporter who's going after the Night Flier story as well. And while the character doesn't weigh too heavily on the overall plot and ultimate outcome, the character wasn't a hindrance or unwelcome addition either. O'Donnell and Pavia also wrote what I consider to be a more dramatic, impactful, conclusive ending, at least in regards to what works well within the medium of film. I won't spoil it here for those of you who haven't seen the movie, but suffice it to say, Dee's confrontation with the vampire creature is not the climax of the film, as it is in the short story, and there is a far more consequential ending for Richard Dees. So when it comes to the changes and additions the writers made to the story, I felt they were smart and ultimately effective. The soundtrack and score were composed by Brian Keane, whose film credits are many, though I didn't recognize a single title among them. Keane took what I would best describe as the Exorcist approach in that he wrote a melody that is creepy, straightforward, repeats often, and is memorable. Much like the song Tubular Bells, better known as the theme from The Exorcist, Keane kept it simple and wrote an earworm rather than an epic masterpiece. From what I can tell, the majority of the score was done using synthesizers and MIDI, but Keane had the good taste to use sounds and voicings that never feel entirely dated or cheesy. The makeup and special effects in the film were done by KNB EFX Group, and for the most part, I'd say they nailed it. KNB was formed by titans of the special effects industry, Robert Kurtzman, Greg Nicotero, and Howard Berger. KNB has worked with everyone from George Romero to Sam Raimi and Quentin Tarantino, and so it's no surprise that the special effects in The Night Flier are one of the film's greatest assets. There are some truly gruesome scenes of mutilated corpses, and the Night Flier himself is pretty damn scary when we finally get a chance to see him in the fourth quarter of the film. As for the cast, actor Miguel Ferrer took the lead as Richard Dees. I felt Ferrer's performance was strong, though his character is such an unlikable asshole throughout the entirety of the film. I never found myself rooting for him. In King's original story, Dees is perhaps a bit of a bloodhound who will go to great lengths to get his story, including bribery and lying. But he never comes off as a total dick. However, in the movie, he's just an overbearing prick from start to finish. The blame for this character portrayal can, of course, not be laid solely at Ferrer's feet, however. Suffice it to say, I would have preferred if O'Donnell and Pavia had given Dees at least some likable characteristics. And this is my one strong negative criticism of the film. Seriously though, Dees has no redeeming qualities, and I simply never felt all that concerned about how things might turn out for him because he was just a complete dickhead the entire time. Other notable performances came from Julie Entwistle, who turns out is actually married to director Mark Pavia, and she was fine, I guess. She wasn't awful or amazing, but her role wasn't exactly pivotal to the film in any way, so her perhaps middle-of-the-road performance wasn't all that detrimental. This is just an aside, Entwistle looks exactly like Phoebe Cates from Drop Dead Fred, and that's who I thought it was until looking at the cast list. I haven't watched Drop Dead Fred in ages, but I remember it being pretty freaking wild. I need to rewatch that movie. Anyway, filming took place in Wilmington, North Carolina, with an estimated budget of about $1 million. But when The Night Flier came out in theaters, it bombed spectacularly, bringing in a measly gross worldwide box office of only $125,000. Now, this seemingly incredible failure wasn't necessarily due to anything being wrong with the film itself, but rather it was the rollout and release of the film that likely led to its disappointing big screen debut. You see, The Night Flier was originally released on HBO in November of 1997, due to some sort of agreement made between Pavia and the film's European investors, and the film wouldn't see a theatrical release until February of '98. Additionally, the theatrical release was limited to the US and Canada, so it never saw a proper worldwide release. In 1997, HBO had a whopping 23 million subscribers, so it's likely that most of the folks who really wanted to see the film had already watched it in the comfort of their own home prior to the theatrical release. Critics of the era were predominantly underwhelmed by the film, and what little praise they offered was given to Farrer's acting and to the practical and makeup effects. However, there were a few critics who took note of the film's commentary on the tabloids and sensational nature of the media. Leah Lowenstein of Variety commented, quote, "The Night Flier is a creepy vampire tale that also offers some clever commentary on bloodthirsty tabloid journalists," unquote. And that's what I want to discuss next, the exploitative nature and shamelessness of journalism that was fomented and fostered during the 90s tabloid craze, and how it inevitably led to journalists, reporters, and the media at large becoming reliant on sensationalism and finding themselves captive to their captive audiences. But first, won't you please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and joining me as I recklessly careen around topics that interest me and forcefully shoehorn them into my videos in an effort to trap unsuspecting audiences into one-sided conversations that are just barely relevant to the film I'm supposed to be discussing. Thanks in advance. Audience capture and sensationalism. In the short story The Night Flier, Richard Dees goes to great lengths to get the most over-the-top, attention-grabbing stories and photographs that he can in order to get the coveted front-page headline spot at Inside View. In the film adaptation, however, he takes things even further and he employs some less than ethical practices to ensure his story and accompanying photos get top billing. Dees knows that sensationalism and going to extremes is the best way for him to get what he wants, and that this kind of behavior, these tactics that exploit shock value, are the most direct path to success. Dees strives to get the readers of Inside View what they want, even if that means manipulating and editorializing the truth. He does what he feels he needs to do to sate his readership's appetite, which in turn ensures his success. Therefore, he is incentivized to take things further in perpetuity. This cycle is what is known as audience capture. Audience capture is best described as a self-reinforcing feedback loop that involves telling one's audience what they want to hear and getting rewarded for it. And audience capture is, of course, all too common when it comes to news and information outlets, and has been for quite some time, particularly in recent years within online social media spaces. Back in the 90s, when the Night Flier was published, newspapers were still an incredibly popular medium with which Americans in particular kept up to date with current affairs. In 1995, more than 2/3 of Americans read a daily newspaper, and while subscriptions and regular readers of daily newspapers have seen a substantial decline since the 90s for obvious reasons, their established, time-tested strategies have been adopted and amplified by newer media mediums. The tabloids walked so that news and information on the internet could not just run, but run rampant. Tabloid newspapers had a simple yet effective strategy to ensure they would grab the attention of potential readers and to increase the likelihood that folks would grab a copy off the rack. Big, bold headlines that screamed even bolder proclamations and controversial claims from their front pages, accompanied by colorful, often graphic, provocative photos. It was a winning combination that moved the most copies. The modern-day equivalent being a well-crafted, clickbait-worthy thumbnail with a provocative title on YouTube. The methods and motivations haven't changed, it's just the format and medium of delivery that has evolved. And so when news and information outlets are reliant on this sales strategy to escalate, or at the very least to maintain a high level of intensity, scandal, and shock value day after day ad infinitum, and the readership expects more and more outrageous, horrific, sensational stories, it creates a symbiotic relationship that becomes difficult to sustain. Journalists, publishers, content creators, etc. become beholden to the precedent they have set, and to the expectations of their readership and or viewership, causing them to constantly try to up the ante. It's a tale as old as time, or at least as old as the printing press. Final thoughts. I decided to delete a large chunk of this script and rewrite it as it started to become more of a look at the modern media, with examples of how sensationalism, embellishment, and audience capture have become a real problem in the age of the internet. But for once I was able to stop myself from getting too carried away and wildly off topic, so you're welcome. Long story short-ish, I was going to cite and provide examples of clickbaity, sensationalist, audience-captured news outlets and content creators from across the ideological spectrum, specifically on YouTube, but you're watching this on YouTube, so you are likely extremely aware of what and who I would have been talking about, and you don't need me to point out the obvious to you. And then I was going to start calling out the outlets which were the most egregious examples of resorting to outrage farming and using disinformation to manipulate their audiences, what they'd likely call embellishing the truth, but it started to feel like a half-baked YouTube drama takedown video, and I'm not trying to get down in the dirt with those folks. Besides, this is supposed to be a Stephen King channel after all, and I seem to have a hard time remembering that on occasion. My apologies. Anyway, as for the Night Flier, overall I thought it was a decent movie. I think making Richard Dees less of a blatant asshole, or at least having him show some character growth, would have been beneficial. However, it wasn't a deal breaker, and that's really the only major criticism I have. So yeah, not that bad really, not among my favorites, but worth a watch in my opinion. You should check it out. My next video will be about the 1996 Nightmares and Dreamscapes TV series, in which I will be discussing and ranking all 8 episodes of the show. I'm honestly looking forward to it, since the episode for Battleground, which I covered in the Night Shift series, was a really well-executed episode. Here's hoping the rest of the series is as good as Battleground, but it probably won't be, because why would it be? That would be nice, and nothing nice ever happens. All right, okay, that's not true. I'm just being dramatic. It's cold in my basement. I'm very cold, and it's been a long year. Speaking of which, 2023 is almost over, and I doubt I'll get any more videos out before the end of the year, so I hope everyone has a nice holiday season, whether you celebrate any particular holiday or not, and I'll see you in 2024 at some point. Thank you for watching. Please click the things to get notifications, and I'll see you next time. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been A Great Undertaking.